Good afternoon, class. This is the second online lecture that I'm doing for both the U.S. History 2 for Pellissippi Dual Enrollment at South Doyle, as well as the night class at Oak Ridge, Roane State. Now, the last lecture we ended with talking about how Americans kind of lived in a world of, well, to be honest, a little bit of paranoia and a little bit of fear. However, I didn't mean to give that entire impression, because the 1950s and the early 1960s were also a time period of hope. The United States had just gotten out of the Great Depression, and it didn't seem that the Depression was going to return once the American economy fully recovered in the 1950s, and the United States had won World War II. And this contributes to the idea of the new liberalism. In the late, or I should say in the post-World War II period, many Americans, whether they be from the left or the right, tended to agree that government had a place in American society and the American economy. The New Deal seemed to prove this. The continuing policies of government involvement in the economy carried out under Harry Truman's Fair Deal tended to prove this. The spending of World War II seemed to prove this. This is codified by a very influential American economist, a fellow by the name of John Kenneth Galbraith. Now, Galbraith modifies the ideas of John Maynard Keynes. Remember from our previous lectures, Keynes was the British economist that argued that when the economy starts to falter, the government can step in and prime the pump by making work, spending money, building government projects like schools and post offices and roads, thus employing individuals who will then have income to raise demand and thus fuel the economy. Consumerism. Well, Galbraith makes the argument of, why can't the government just continually spend money to keep the economy from ever turning down in the first place? And so this is part of the rationale behind continuing government activity in the 1950s that is not challenged by the Republicans. It's really not challenged by many conservatives. Instead, it is accepted. Now, one reason why conservatives in this country accept this continued spending is, first, part of this government spending is on defense, fighting communism, which conservatives truly believe in. The second is the American economy is going so great during the 1950s that no one really argues that the government can't tax part of it and, well, do things with it. And so good government means activist government. Americans buy into this idea that the government, especially the national government, can be used as a tool to, while facing communism abroad, can be used to fight economic and then later racial equality at home, as well as providing education and other necessary services to the population. And this is best illustrated in the 1960 presidential election. Richard Milhous Nixon, represented the old view. Nixon, at least in 1960, argued that the U.S. government needed to scale back. It needed to cut spending. Whereas John F. Kennedy argued for greater government involvement, such as education and, most notably, space exploration. And so, on the one hand, Nixon his ideas seem kind of pessimistic. His ideas argued that the United States needed to scale back for fear of overtaxing the U.S. economy, whereas Kennedy appeared optimistic. Not only did he argue that Uncle Sam can do it, but he said Uncle Sam can take us to the stars, literally. And this contrast between sort of a pessimistic view and an optimistic view is also highlighted in how they looked. Nixon, who wasn't that much older than Kennedy, looked a lot older. Nixon was a traditional campaigner, so when Nixon and Kennedy were scheduled to have the first televised debate of the election ever. This is the first televised presidential debate ever, but it's also the first one and only one that they had during the presidential campaign. Nixon hits the road, campaigns hard, and then that night shows up tired, kind of disheveled, 5 o'clock stubble. They put this pasty makeup on him, whereas Kennedy, knowing the power of television, doesn't campaign that day. Instead, wakes up late, has a late lunch, goes over his notes with his presidential campaign staff, comes into the debate looking refreshed, vigorous, virile, and so this affects how people view the ideas that these men are putting across, because those Americans who listened to the debate on radio, for example, they handed the win to Nixon. They said in polls taken afterwards that Nixon had won. However, those that had watched the TV debate, of course on TV, they handed it to JFK. And since most Americans now had TVs in their home and most Americans had watched the debate rather than listened to the debate, this reflected Kennedy's landslide victory in 1960. Now, while Kennedy would expand the role of government, it was his successor, Lyndon Baines Johnson, who would really expand the role of the federal government in Americans' lives. In 1964, after Kennedy was assassinated, Johnson would wait until he won his own election that November. In that election, 1964, you have a similar sort of recurrence of the ideas between LBJ and his Republican opponent, Barry Goldwater. Barry Goldwater, of course, is the guy in the horn-rimmed glasses right here. Now, Goldwater argues that, again, if the government spends too much money, not only is it going to overtax the economy, Goldwater argued that it's going to create a level of dependency on government expenditures that will hurt the American character. Johnson, on the other hand, argued that Americans needed government spending. It needed it not only to keep the economy going, but the government could be used selectively in order to create a great society, as Johnson called it. So what was Johnson's Great Society? Because in 1964, Johnson again is going to win a landslide victory because Americans buy into this idea of the new liberalism. Well, LBJ is going to initiate what he called a war on poverty. You're going to see the creation of various new agencies like the Department of Housing and Urban Development, and the expansion of pre-existing programs like Social Security. Housing and urban development. Well, housing and urban development will provide housing to the poorest within American communities. Johnson and his supporters argue that if we're going to provide Social Security benefits and aid to dependent children, we need to provide them with housing as well. We also need to provide the weakest in society health care. So it's under the Great Society that you have the creation of Medicare for the elderly and Medicaid for the poor. Now let's look at the elderly. The elderly had been promised the entitlement of Social Security insurance in the New Deal. Well, LBJ is going to expand Social Security because before the Great Society, Social Security was mainly a fallback for when nothing else worked, basically. Social Security was to keep the elderly from starving, nothing more. LBJ is going to promise that Social Security is going to be a retirement system, not an emergency fallback plan. So the expansion of Social Security into a retirement entitlement program starts under the Great Society. Now the problem with the expansion of Social Security as well as the creation of these new Great Society programs is that where's the money going to come from? Well, LBJ will shepherd through Congress not only taxes but also a change in the Social Security plan. Because before the Great Society, all money that was taxed under Social Security went into an overall Social Security fund that could only be used for Social Security benefits. After the Great Society, even though on your pay stub it says Social Security taxes, those taxes go into the general fund, and they can be used however the government sees fit. So what is in the Social Security Trust Fund? Basically a bunch of government IOUs. What we're paying in today, those of you who are working and those who are going to work soon be working, is not going into Social Security for your retirement later on. Instead, it is immediately going out to not only pay for Social Security benefits today, but other government programs as well. And one of those government programs that is expanded in the 1960s under the Great Society is federal aid to public schools. Before 1965, most funding for public schools came from the local communities. However, starting in 1965, the federal government is going to send money to elementary and high schools to fund, well, better school buildings, books, things like that. However, one of the controversies that exists now and existed then was the fact that with the introduction of government money to the public schools, government schools, is this gives the government the right to mandate certain things. So whenever you hear Common Core or No Child Left Behind or Race to the Top, all of these federal mandates on what can be taught, what should be taught, how it should be taught. The reason why schools obey these mandates is because if they don't, they lose this aid right here. Now finally, another part of the Great Society was the belief that commercial society was crass, that commercial society wasn't really, well, it didn't really have social value. Supporters of the Great Society argued that since America was so affluent, since America had so much money being made, this money could be taxed off, and the government could use it to selectively foster the arts, education, and children's programming. So in the 1960s, you see the creation of the National Endowments for the Arts and Humanities. Now, the National Endowments for the Arts, otherwise known as the NEA, will be used to fund artists, musicians, and, well, symphony orchestras and things like that. Now, many of us could say, well, what's wrong with that? Well, these are needed for cultural refinement. However, some artists who get NEA funds are highly controversial. In the 1980s, for example, John Mapplethorpe, a very controversial artist, will create several very controversial pieces of art under National Endowment of the Arts grants. The most controversial are two that I can think of. One is a picture of a beaker of urine with an upside-down crucifix in it. The other is a picture of a man's rear end with a bullwhip shoved where it shouldn't be. Let's just put it that way. Because Mapplethorpe was openly gay, and that was his expression of his sexuality. Of course, conservatives in this country pointed to this as the National Endowment of the Arts gone wrong. And so it opens the doorway, this use of public funds, of should we use public funds, your tax money, for art? Especially if some of that art is what many people consider not to be art. Another use of National Endowment of the Arts money is something that you guys might not think of, but it is National Public Radio and public broadcasting stations, PBS. PBS is partially funded by NEA grants, as is National Public Radio. Now, of course, one of the most famous shows from PBS, of course, is Sesame Street. Sesame Street gets its start here from WRC-TV. I believe that's in either Cleveland or Cincinnati, Ohio. It was originally known as Sam and Friends. It introduced the world to the Muppets. And it was aimed not at purely entertaining children, but instead entertaining children in a way that educated them. Like you have The Count. Today we're going to look at the letter M. Because proponents of public broadcasting argued that commercial broadcasting, with all of its shows geared toward either entertainment or marketing, really didn't have any social value. Public broadcasting was aimed to remediate that. However, again, like giving money to artists, public broadcasting opened up controversy that is still with us today, because many opponents of public broadcasting make this argument. Isn't a public broadcasting station, whether it be radio or TV, that is directly linked to the government and funding from the government, isn't it beholden to that government? Isn't it basically just a mouthpiece of the government, thus a propaganda organ of the government? This is a debate that is still going on in American society today. But we can see that the role of government grows exponentially between the 1960s and the early 2000s. Here is just anti-poverty spending. So this is, housing and urban development, aid to dependent children, and Medicaid. In 1962, it was only about 2.5% of all federal expenditures. By 2003, it was closing in to 1/5 of federal expenditures. So, this is a massive growth in, government spending in American society. Well, while the spending for anti-poverty programs increased during the 1960s, so did defense spending. While, as you can see back here, anti-poverty spending was 16%, a little bit over that. During the 1960s, going into the Vietnam War, the level of defense spending in this country mushrooms to about 1/3. So 30% of the federal budget was defense spending. Where does this come from? Well, part of this comes from the fact that under the Kennedy administration, the conventional forces of the U.S. military are going to be expanded. Between the election of Dwight D. Eisenhower in 1952 and the election of John F. Kennedy in 1960, the world had radically changed. In 1952, when Eisenhower is elected, most of the world is still divided up among European empires, controlled by European empires. However, by 1960, much of the world had become liberated or was in the process of freeing itself from the shackles of imperialism. The Third World emerges. So the nations in the Pacific, in Africa, even in Latin America, these countries, some of them new to governance and never really countries before they were colonized. These countries are going to be the battlegrounds of the Cold War. And in order to help nations that are friendly, these new nations that are friendly to America, Kennedy will exchange Eisenhower's massive retaliation policy for a more, conventional policy he calls flexible response. The problem with massive retaliation, according to Kennedy, is that it's based on a full-fledged nuclear retaliatory strike. Basically, if the Soviets do anything, we nuke them. Well, what happens if the Soviets are involved in a country that we are allied with in, say, Africa or Asia, but is not taking direct action against us? Do we nuke them then? No. According to Kennedy, we should be flexible. If the Soviets attack us, we should have the nuclear stockpile. But if they threaten other areas of the world, we should be able to send in special forces, such as the Green Berets. These special forces, as they are called, are aimed at operating behind not behind enemy lines, but on the ground with the people. Because originally the Green Berets were not black operators that were expert killers. They were trained to operate on their own and be highly efficient at combat. But at the same time, you have special forces members that are trained to be engineers, civil servants, medical specialists, and so on and so forth, so that they could provide services in hotly contested areas. Of course, these Green Berets and other special forces are going to be put to the test very, very soon. Because the Cold War is going to be sort of it's going to heat up in the early 1960s. Because with the decline of the European empires, while the threat of nuclear war kind of subsides, conflict, or the threat of conflict, is going to increase. In 1961, the Soviets are going to try and get the West to basically abandon West Berlin again, like they had in 1948. Before 1960, the only thing that separated West Berlin from East Berlin was a line on the map. And people in East Germany, especially East Berlin, were fleeing the communist regime of the newly created East Germany and basically walking right across the street into West Berlin. The initial response to this was for the East Germans and the Soviets to try and push the Western powers out of West Berlin. There's a tense standoff in 1961 that finally ends in a negotiated settlement whereupon the status of the West in West Berlin is reaffirmed. The response to that is that the Soviets will help the East Germans build this right here. This is the Berlin Wall. Literally, the Soviets will divide the entire city, building a wall around the entire perimeter of West Berlin, to seal it off, if you will, from the rest of East Germany, to keep people from having access to that route of escape. It becomes a symbol of the, well, brutality of the communist regime, because this wall was not designed to keep West Berliners out of East Germany. It was designed to keep East Germans in their own country. Now, another crisis that happens in the early 1960s is the Cuban Missile Crisis. In 1959, Fidel Castro successfully overthrows the military dictator that had been allied with the United States, a fellow by the name of Batista. Now, Batista flees, goes into exile, and Castro becomes the new leader of a new communist Cuba. In 1961, Kennedy authorizes a CIA operation that will become known as the Bay of Pigs. It's an operation designed whereupon Cubans that had fled from Cuba when Castro took power would be trained to basically reinvade the island. The Bay of Pigs operation fails. But what happens is it makes Castro fearful that the U.S. will invade Cuba at any time. So between 1961 and 1962, Castro will cozy up even closer to the Soviet Union of Nikita Khrushchev. Now, the Soviets, of course, see this as a golden opportunity, not just of winning over another country to communism, but Cuba is just 90 miles off the coast of America. If Cuba was militarized, it could be a staging area in order to intimidate the United States. And one way the Soviets are going to intimidate the United States is by emplacing medium-range, intermediate nuclear missiles. These missiles do not have the same range as intercontinental ballistic missiles, but they're designed to be stationed that much closer to the target. Now, in early October 1962, American spy planes discover these nuclear launch facilities, these missile launch facilities, before they're operational. The United States, under John F. Kennedy, is going to basically confront the Soviets over these missiles. What is Kennedy's alternatives? Does he invade the island? That would immediately lead to World War III. So he publicly, on TV, issues the orders for what he calls a quarantine. Now, this quarantine is nothing more than a blockade. Now, under international law, a blockade is a cause for going to war. Not on the U.S. going to war, but the country being blockaded. And if Cuba was, wanted to go to war, they could have. That's why Kennedy calls it a quarantine. The reason why neither side wants to go to war, even though the Soviets rattle their sabers that this is a this is a cause for war, is they know that if war breaks out, it's going to go nuclear. And so, in the latter half of October 1962, while publicly the two sides eye each other and face each other off, behind the scenes they desperately work for a solution. They come to the solution that the Soviets will publicly remove their missiles from Cuba because they were caught, red-handed with them. However, the U.S. will give them a bone. They will remove similar missiles from Turkey, but they get to do it secretly so that they don't have to have egg on their face. Now, what else is going on in the early 1960s? Well, those freedom rides that I mentioned in the first or the last lecture are continuing in 1961. Violence is erupting because of these freedom rides. So finally, in 1961, Kennedy orders the federal marshals, the Marshal Service, to restore order, using the authority given to the federal government by the Morgan versus Virginia ruling of 1946. This is interstate commerce. So federal marshals will provide security for these civil rights workers. They will, the marshals that is, they will basically support them against not only other individuals who are against desegregation, but also local and state authorities. Because the early 1960s are a time where the classic era of the civil rights movement sort of reaches its zenith. It climaxes at this time because groups like the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the Congress on Racial Equality, and Martin Luther King's Southern Christian Leadership Conference is going to challenge Jim Crow out in the open in the 1960s, or at least in the early 1960s. Now, these organizations, especially the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Council, are organized to willingly face down white resistance. And this is best illustrated in the March on Birmingham. The SCLC will basically organize several marches throughout the early 1960s in order to illustrate the brutality of Jim Crow and racist thought in America. And the Birmingham March is probably the most illustrative. It's probably one of the most famous. Because in April and May of 1963, Martin Luther King is going to lead a march of mainly black civil rights workers, but also white civil rights activists against, the racist Jim Crow laws placed in Birmingham, Alabama. What's the response of Birmingham and the government of Birmingham? Well, the Commissioner of Public Safety, a fellow by the name of Bull Connor, will take a hardline approach. He will order the Birmingham Fire Department to use fire hoses at full strength against these marchers. Now, literally, you can be killed by being hit by a fire hose at full strength, let alone being thrown against hard objects. The Birmingham police will sick attack dogs on these peaceful marchers. Now, this is done on purpose by both sides. Bull Connor is trying to intimidate them. But in trying to intimidate them, Bull Connor and the supporters of segregation and Jim Crow are playing right into the hands of the civil rights movement, because Martin Luther King is taking a page from the nonviolent policies of Mahatma Gandhi of India. Because what he is doing is he's forcing the opponents of civil rights to show their true colors. Because what goes on in Birmingham is televised. And Americans from around the country see the brutality against these peaceful marchers. And many Americans, especially white Americans, start to lose faith. They start to lose support in the promises that we can have a separate but equal society. This also forces the government to act. So Kennedy and then later Johnson are going to use federal troops to support the desegregation of schools. They're going to use federal troops to, again, protect civil rights workers, because in 1964 and later in 1965, Lyndon Baines Johnson, after becoming president after Kennedy's assassination, is going to shepherd through Congress and then sign into law the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The Civil Rights Act of 64 is pretty simple. If someone has their civil rights infringed upon, this now becomes a federal matter that can be tried in federal court. Likewise, if somebody is denied the right to vote, this is something that the federal government can take action upon. So these laws legitimize the role of the federal government in areas where it had traditionally not had a role in. Now, the early 1960s are also a time period of increased American involvement in Southeast Asia. The Vietnam War gets started for America in the early 1960s. But before we talk about that, we have to understand where this war comes from. We have to go back to even before World War II. In the 1920s and 1930s, the French, of course, have and control what is today Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. It was called French Indochina. It was a colony of them. Now, they faced, by the 20s and 30s, a nationalist movement known as the Viet Minh. The Viet Minh were led by this fellow right here. This is Ho Chi Minh. Now, Ho Chi Minh is an interesting character in that he is both a nationalist and a communist. Communism is an international ideology. True communists argue that nationalism is a fiction used to divide the working class. So Ho Chi Minh, while a communist, is also a nationalist. So this is kind of an odd combination. He's a nationalist because he wants to see Vietnam free of French control. But at the same time, he wants the newly freed Vietnam to be a communist government and society. Now, the Viet Minh are going to fight the French both before World War II and then after World War II. After World War II, this fight for freedom and being free of the French is going to culminate in 1954. In 1954, the Viet Minh deliver a decisive defeat to the French at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. This battle is so much of a blow to the French that it causes the French government to collapse. It causes the French public to demand that they exit Vietnam. So in 1954, the French are going to meet and negotiate in Geneva, Switzerland with the communist Vietnamese. This results in the Geneva Conference of 1954. Now, this conference will lead to the French leaving Vietnam, and instead of being French Indochina, the area will be divided into 4 parts: Laos, Cambodia. But since the north is controlled already by the communists, but the south is still very much anti-communist, Vietnam will be divided into North and South Vietnam. North Vietnam, being communist, will fall under the inside the orbit of other communist countries like China and especially the Soviet Union. The South, however, will become sort of a client state of the United States. The United States will give money to the South Vietnamese government and help support the new president of South Vietnam, a fellow by the name of Dinh Dong Diem. I know it's Nim Dinh Dong. Sorry, I cannot pronounce Diem's last name. I'm sorry. Let's just call him as Diem. Now, Diem is a controversial political leader from the very start, because while he is pro-Western, he is not a Democrat. Because the Geneva Conference of 54 stipulated that within 5 years, 1959, there would be a popular election to reunify Vietnam under one government. And Diem fully understands that at least in the 1950s, the communists under Ho Chi Minh are incredibly popular and that they would win. And so he's not going to hold the elections, and of course the United States is not going to balk at that. The American government's not going to balk at it. Now, Diem is going to rule pretty much as an authoritarian leader. He's going to use the military as sort of his own personal police force. Now, Diem is also controversial within Vietnamese society, because not only is he authoritarian, he is in the minority because Diem is Catholic. Only about 5% of the Vietnamese population is Catholic. Over 90% are Buddhist. However, the vast majority of the high offices that Diem awards are to friends and family that are mainly Catholic, and they start passing laws that favor Catholics over Buddhists. So in 1962, let's see here, actually it's in June of 1963, a Buddhist monk by the name of Thich Quang Duc sits down in the middle of a busy intersection in Saigon, pours gasoline over his head, then takes out a Zippo and ignites it in protest to the Diem regime. Now, Diem will become so, unpopular with the Vietnamese people that many American officials fear that he himself is going to be the cause of a communist revolution in South Vietnam. So in the early part of November 1963, the military of South Vietnam is going to stage a coup against Diem. This is done with the blessing of the American government. So on November 2nd, 1963, Diem is removed. And while being transported to Tan Son Nhut Airport, the main air base in Saigon, he is assassinated. This seems very ironic because just 20 days later, on November 22nd, 1963, the man who authorized the assassination of Diem, John F. Kennedy, will also be assassinated in Dallas. Now, the removal of Diem does not immediately mean that America is going to become intimately involved in Vietnam. America's involvement in Vietnam is an evolution. It's a progression. Now, why does America get involved in the first place? Well, it has to do with the mentality of American leaders after World War II. Many American leaders in the post-war era argued that if the Allies of World War I had stood up to Hitler when he started demanding territorial concessions, that World War II never would have happened, that Hitler would have been kept in check. That the worst thing that the British and the French did was make a deal with Hitler at Munich in 1938. Instead of dealing with the North, American leaders argue that the only way to face the North Vietnamese is with force. For this reason, the U.S. military in the 1960s, the early 1960s, 1962 and 1963, will basically have an increasing role in supporting South Vietnamese operations against North Vietnam. One of these operations is the use of American destroyers to gather signals intelligence that would later be used by South Vietnamese special forces, like radar signals, radio traffic, and things like that. While conducting one of these, electronic sweeps, an American destroyer, the USS Maddox, will supposedly come under attack by North Vietnamese gunboats. The next night, the Maddox that was joined by the destroyer Turner Joy was supposedly also attacked. This happens on August 2nd and 4th, 1964. However, historical evidence that has recently come to light in the past decade or so has come to question whether these attacks actually took place. First and foremost, both nights were very stormy. There was a lot of waves. There was no particular damage to either ship. And the only evidence of any attack are blurry radar images that could easily be wave tops. This is not to say that the North Vietnamese may have had warships in the area, but they may not have attacked the Maddox or Turner Joy. However, Lyndon Johnson is going to use this, quote, attack as an excuse to ask Congress for authorization for military force in Vietnam. And he gets this on August 2nd or August 7th, 1964, in what becomes known as the Tonkin Gulf Resolution. Basically, the resolution states that the president has the power to defend South Vietnam by any means necessary. Basically, it's a blank check. And so, what LBJ is going to start is, well, a very odd form of warfare. Because on the one hand, the U.S. military that is directed intimately by the president is going to use military force to try and force the North Vietnamese to negotiate. But at the same time, the full force of the American military is not going to be used, both to try and show the Vietnamese that we're not really wanting to fight, and secondly, not to antagonize the Soviets for fear of starting World War III. So this carrot and stick approach will be typified by, well, bombings on and off starting in 1965, Operation Rolling Thunder, for example, where the U.S. Air Force and Navy are going to bomb selected targets in North Vietnam, where other targets, just as important and even sometimes more important targets, are off the target list. Also, the U.S. military is going to start to land ground forces in South Vietnam because some of the aircraft are flying from air bases in South Vietnam. These air bases come under attack from the communist insurgents in South Vietnam that are popularly known as the Viet Cong, or VC. Now, the VC start to attack air bases like the Marine Air Base at Da Nang. So U.S. Marines land in 1965, March of 1965, in order to protect those air bases. However, those Marines guarding the perimeter will come under attack, justifying further troop deployments so that U.S. forces can patrol beyond the perimeter of these air bases and other military installations, thus slowly increasing American involvement in Vietnam. Now, as this involvement increases, LBJ believes that he can bring the North to the bargaining table. How does he do this? Well, through massive bombing under Operation Rolling Thunder, and then stopping the bombing when the United States has the advantage to try and say, we're willing to stop. Are you? In the South, the United States is going to continue to build up from 1964 and 65 until its apex in 1968. We're going to build air bases. And at the height, the United States is going to have close to 400,000 troops in country. That's the maximum number that the United States has in Vietnam. And those 400,000 troops by 1968 are not just going to be guarding air bases and military bases. They're going to be used in what is known as search and destroy missions to try and seek out and destroy the communist insurgents and the regular army of North Vietnam, the NVA, the North Vietnamese Army, that is operating in South Vietnam. So what's the effect of this massive influx of U.S. soldiers on Vietnam? Well, on the one side, it has a debilitating effect on the morale of the South Vietnamese military. They've basically been pushed aside. They are now the junior partners in this war. And as a result, corruption, lethargy, basically working for the enemy, becomes chronic in the South Vietnamese military. As well, if you introduce 300, 400,000 virile young American men into this country, they're well paid 3 times as much as their South Vietnamese counterpart. What do you think's going to happen? Crime, prostitution, vice, drug abuse are going to explode. They're going to become endemic in the Vietnam War, especially as these troops see no point to their deployments. Because between 1965 and 1968, the United States is not going to fight to hold territory. Instead, it is going to fight a war of attrition. This is General Westmoreland, General William Westmoreland. Westmoreland argues that this war is all about killing more of the enemy than they kill of us, to destroy their capacity to fight. And so operations in Vietnam are going to be engineered to basically go out, carry out what are known as sweeps, where you have massive units going through the jungle or the highlands, grasslands, and things like that, trying to seek out the enemy and kill it. The only problem is U.S. forces are operating in the enemy's backyard. So most of the time, fighting is at the behest of the enemy. The enemy initiates contact, not the American troops. So it's always sort of the Americans running into enemy ambushes. Now, even though the enemy oftentimes initiates combat, they tend to be the ones that die the most. American firepower is brought to bear increasingly against the VC and NVA forces. The body count ratio is far in favor of the United States. You know, while American troops might lose 10 people in a battle, the Viet Cong and the NVA, they lose 200 people. The one thing that American leaders like Westmoreland fail to realize throughout these 3 years is that the communists are willing to make that sacrifice. They're willing to suffer these losses. Now, by 1968, communist operations in South Vietnam start to slacken. They start to scale back. And Westmoreland argues that this is the light at the end of the tunnel, that this is proof that his war of attrition is working. But what is actually happening is that the enemy, the NVA and the VC, are husbanding their forces. They're not seeking battle because they're building up their forces in the South for a massive all-out effort. The plan for the communists is simple. Attack the major urban areas, seize them, and basically cause a communist uprising among the population. This becomes known as Tet 68, or the Tet Offensive. Now, Tet happens in January 30th, 1968. It is the Chinese New Year. During this communist offensive, the VC will come out of their hiding places. They will fight American and South Vietnamese forces in the open. They will seize the entire city of Hue, which is about halfway up the South Vietnamese countryside. They will do heavy damage to Saigon, one of the most secure cities in South Vietnam. They'll actually penetrate and do major damage. They'll run amok for an hour or so in the U.S. Embassy. It will take weeks for American forces to retake Hue. It will take days before Saigon is re-secured. And while this is a tactical victory, because at the end of the day, at the end of the Tet Offensive, the Viet Cong, that domestic insurgent force, is almost completely wiped out. Instead of fighting from the shadows, instead of fighting in ambush, they come out and fight as a conventional force, and American firepower decimates them. However, this tactical victory does not translate to a strategic victory, because Americans who had been told, we're winning, we're winning, we're winning, all of a sudden on TV they see the communists make this massive attack, and all of a sudden Americans start to question, are they being lied to? Is this the light at the end of the tunnel, or is this an oncoming train? Because the Viet Cong War is going to act as a catalyst. It's going to act as the knife that starts to cut the bonds that hold American society together. Because whatever, race, color, creed, political persuasion you are in the United States, this war has a draining effect on the American attitude toward the war. Because every night Americans watch this war live in some cases, or at least the footage is just a few hours old. And so Americans are watching the Tet Offensive. They're watching Americans get injured and even die in combat. And during the Tet Offensive, they see this classic photo happen. They actually, this is a photo, but at the same time there was a TV photographer, cameraman, who caught this actually happen. This is the police chief of Saigon. If you didn't know what had happened, all you see on TV is he walks up, takes out his pistol, and you see a man's brains blown out on TV. And of course, this is our ally killing what seems to be a civilian. What was not told in the media at the time is that this police chief right here was just told that his family had been executed by Viet Cong insurgents. And this man right here was a man who was just captured fighting as a Viet Cong insurgent. So in his, hatred and grief, he killed the closest VC that he had access to with his service pistol. So this brings up the question, during the Vietnam War, was the media biased? This is a question that we still are dealing with today. Was the media biased against the war? Well, many historians argue that they were. However, other historians point out that the nature of the war made it necessarily a brutal and unpopular war, because Americans are dying. Americans are being shipped home in body bags and coffins. In total, over 55,000 Americans will die between 1963 and 1975. And for what? Americans are watching this on TV, and we see, battles that seemingly have no point. Americans seizing hills only to abandon them days later. This isn't World War II, where you have this great crusade of liberating territory day after day after day. This is a war that's measured in body count, the number of people that are dead. It's also a costly war. Increasingly, from 1963 to 1969, this war will assume more and more of the federal budget. This is no longer a sideshow war. This is a very expensive war. And one of the things that this is going to generate is opposition. Not among mainstream adult Americans, but first among young Americans, most notably college students. It is the war that helps recreate and reform the left in American politics. The new left emerges on American campuses because the old left, the old progressives and New Dealers had seemingly failed America. The new left embraces socialism. The new left even embraces communism. The new left argues that this war in Vietnam is a capitalist war, a rich man's war and a poor man's fight. We see this in the formation of the Students for a Democratic Society, the SDS. The SDS is formed in 1964 by Tom Hayden. Tom Hayden, a college student, issues what becomes known as the Port Huron Manifesto. Now, the Port Huron Manifesto argues that capitalism, that the Western, capitalist society is evil, not just because it oppresses the working class, but as seen in Vietnam, it is necessarily racist. It is what justifies Jim Crow in the South and the war against brown people in Southeast Asia. And so the new left will be linked intimately with the anti-war movement. These are people who protest the war not just because they agree with the new left, but many are anti-war because they see no point in the war and they don't want to get drafted to be sent to this war. Now, coming out of the new left and the anti-war movement, you will have the American counterculture, the counterculture of the 1960s. Now, what is the counterculture? Let me get to my notes here. Hold on. Now, the counterculture is born in two places. It's born in 1964, 1965 in the Haight-Ashbury district of San Francisco and Greenwich Village in New York City. The counterculture is not only a sub-part of the anti-war movement. They tend to align themselves with the new left, but they focus more on cultural elements. They reject the men in the gray suits. They embrace some of the ideas of the beatniks. They go farther than that, arguing that all cultural norms that were put forward in the Cleaver Society of the 1950s should be rejected. Instead, they argue that society should be communal, that property should be shared, that marriage was just a way of keeping women oppressed, and instead should, love should be free, that people should, just have sex randomly, they should be part of a community rather than part of a family. And this new movement that is best typified by the hippies and the yippies, even though the hippies are just a small fraction of the counterculture. This counterculture will embrace even a new music that represents them, starting out with the British invasion, like the Beatles and the Who and the Stones. But other bands, American bands, will embrace this, like Fleetwood Mac, the Grateful Dead, the Mamas and the Papas, Jimi Hendrix, Bob Dylan, Joan Baez, Led Zeppelin. These bands will focus instead upon, anti-war themes, political themes like Bob Dylan, focusing on psychedelic drugs like the Grateful Dead and Led Zeppelin initially. They'll focus in on this new culture that stands in opposition to the mainstream culture of the 1950s. Now, the war will actually start, will actually initiate the riots and will pull at the very bonds that hold America together. By 1968 and 1969, America culturally is starting to come apart at the seams. We see this in the presidential election of 1968, because in 1968, Richard Nixon is running again as the Republican, but the Democrats, you have a full slate of individuals that are running. You have men like, let's see here, I can't remember McCarthy's last name. Let me find this in my notes. Hold on. Let's see here. Well, I don't have it down. Hold on a minute. The beauties of having access. Eugene McCarthy. So don't get Joseph McCarthy and Eugene McCarthy mixed up. You have people like Eugene McCarthy, who is running on a running on an anti-war ticket. You have Hubert Humphrey, who is the Democratic, the Democratic Party's favored, favored candidate. But before he's assassinated, you also have JFK's younger brother, Robert Kennedy, who is also running on an anti-war ticket. Well, Robert Kennedy is assassinated, as well as Martin Luther King. So, you have these assassinations early in 1968 that cause riots, they cause political upheaval. And so the only anti-war candidate that is still in the race is Eugene McCarthy. However, despite having the strong support of the anti-war movement that is literally camped outside the presidential convention, the Democratic Party presidential convention in Chicago, the Democratic Party, the machine, nominates Hubert Humphrey. This causes the anti-war protesters to move out of the parks that they had sort of set up their protest in and start protesting directly in front of the hotel where the presidential convention is being held. This causes Mayor Richard Daley, who is the party boss of Chicago, he's the mayor of Chicago, and he's not known as, how would you say, well, he's known as being basically a political boss. He orders out every cop in Chicago, even reserve cops, to go and not only put down this protest, but to basically crush it. And so what you have is the image of cops beating up young Americans, teenagers, college kids, beating them up, hauling them away in paddy wagons. You have even some of the cops beating up reporters, Like Dan Rather was accosted and beat up at this time. He was a low-level reporter at the convention. As one reporter called it, it was a police riot. And so Americans who are watching this on TV are, well, let's just put it this way, they're freaked out. That's the best way to put it. And so instead of voting for the Democratic Party, which had been the major party in politics up until 1968, they're going to elect Richard Nixon because Nixon promises to restore order, restore Americans' order to society, and to get America out of Vietnam with honor. Now, what else is happening besides the political upheaval? Well, you have the civil rights movement change. It metamorphosizes in the 1960s. In the late 1960s, new voices are sort of beginning to be heard in the civil rights movement. One most notable is a man by the name of Malcolm X. Malcolm X is a black nationalist. He is initially a follower of Elijah Muhammad, the founder of Black Islam, the Nation of Islam as it's officially known. Now, unlike Martin Luther King, black nationalists argue that we don't want a place at the white table. We want our own table that is separate from white society, but not controlled by white society. So they reject Jim Crow and white law, but they also reject basically being part of mainstream white American society. Now, why is black nationalism, what will become known as black power, why is it becoming more popular than the civil rights in the 1950s and early 1960s? Well, even though the civil rights movement that was led by King was successful, it still failed in many respects. In the late 1960s, America's inner cities are still predominantly poor and still predominantly black. So young black urban Americans, they don't see the successes of voting in the South. They could care less about what's going on in the South. They're arguing that I still don't have a job, I still live in a hole in the ground, I still live in a high crime neighborhood. What is Whitey going to do for me? And so they become attracted to men like Malcolm X. And this dissatisfaction with the slow progress of civil rights is best illustrated in race riots that erupt in 1964, 1967, and also in 1968 after Martin Luther King and Malcolm X are assassinated. Again, America is coming apart at the seams. Now, it's not just black Americans who are demanding sort of their special status within American society. As we'll talk about later on in class, hopefully, Asian Americans, Latino Americans, women, and later on gay Americans are going to start to pressure for their place within American society. We're going to have the beginnings of the minority rights movement, where America becomes a hyphenated society, where I'm no longer an American, I am African American, or I am Latino American, or I am Irish American, or I am, whatever American. This starts at this time. But before we talk about that, and before we get to the 1970s, we have to talk about the end of the war that initiated all of this. Because by 1969, American society is getting tired of Vietnam. They're getting tired of the losses. They're getting tired of the endless nature of this war. Once elected in 1968, Richard Nixon promises to remove America, but remove America with honor. One of the things that he does is he secretly goes to China in 1971. In 1971 and 1972, Nixon will secretly fly to China, meet with Mao Zedong, the leader of the Communist Party of Communist China. Why does he do this? Well, by opening up China, by starting negotiations with China for political recognition, international recognition, and trade deals, Nixon hopes to basically make China not support the North Vietnamese, which they quit doing by 1973. Nixon will also initiate stronger bombing of North Vietnam. So instead of the selective bombing of Operation Rolling Thunder, Under Nixon, you will see basically all-out bombing of Vietnam under Operation Linebacker 1 and Linebacker 2. The increased bombing of North Vietnam, including areas that had been previously off limits to bombing, causes the North Vietnamese to, well, come back to the negotiating table. Also, Nixon will secretly invade Cambodia. Now, I wish I had a map right here, but I don't. But, well, let's see here. I control this computer, so I'm going to find a map. So if you will hold on really, really quickly. This is best illustrated with a map. Images. Not news, images. Now, if we're looking at a map right here, I'm just going to leave it right like this. Cambodia, right here, is very close to the most built-up areas of South Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh City right here is the new name of what used to be known as Saigon. And what was happening is throughout the war, the North Vietnamese were transporting supplies down through Laos and into Cambodia, where they used Cambodia as a staging area to attack into Vietnam. Well, in 1972, Nixon will authorize what becomes known as the Cambodia incursion. This is basically an invasion of Vietnam, or not an invasion of Vietnam, but invasion of Cambodia. Let's get back to the slide here. However, news of the Cambodian incursion will make it back to the United States, and of course Nixon will have to cut it short. While American troops are conducting the Cambodian incursion, other American troops are being withdrawn from Vietnam. So between 1972 and 1973, American troops are going to basically be scaled back from Vietnam. Let's hold on a minute. I got to look up something. Because Nixon is following a policy that he calls Vietnamization. He is turning over the war to the South Vietnamese military. While American troops are withdrawn, more and more of the operations in Vietnam, starting in 1969 and 1970, are being turned over to the South Vietnamese military. This culminates in an operation that is known as Lam Song 719. Let me see. Let me make sure I gave you the right Cambodian incursion. For the Cambodian incursion. Cambodia is not 71, it's 1970. So, in 1970, the United States Army and military makes the Cambodian incursion. In 1971, the South Vietnamese military is going to invade Laos. So, trying to cut the Ho Chi Minh Trail in Laos, the South Vietnamese military is going to try and cut across the southernmost part of Laos. However, this operation is a near disaster because the South Vietnamese military is caught off guard. They basically are cut off by North Vietnamese troops in Laos and have to retreat in disorder. The failure of Lam Song 719 actually leads to the North Vietnamese to try a conventional full-scale invasion of South Vietnam in late 1972. This becomes known as the Easter Offensive. And so, it starts in March of 1972 and continues until October of 72. Sorry for getting the dates mixed up. So, this becomes known as the Easter Offensive. And So you have this conventional attack upon South Vietnam, and the South Vietnamese military barely, and I stress barely, beats back the North Vietnamese invasion. It has a lot of help from the U.S. Air Force, most notably B-52s that come in and carpet bomb the southernmost part of North Vietnam, the southernmost part of Laos, and the northernmost part of South Vietnam. So it's basically heavy American ordnance being dropped that helps rescue the South Vietnamese military. Now, this is what happens between 1972 and 1975. As we'll talk about next class period, Richard Nixon will be forced from office in 1974 because of the Watergate scandal. His vice president, Gerald Ford, will be pretty much a lame duck president. During that time period, the U.S. Congress will cut off all aid, financial and military, to the South Vietnamese. The U.S. Congress is basically washing their hands of the Vietnam War. This has a devastating effect on the South Vietnamese military because the South Vietnamese military had been built up into a large mechanized, clone of the U.S. military. But it was highly dependent on fuel and highly dependent on U.S. aid. Once that fuel and aid was cut off, it had a limited amount of time it could operate before it basically ran out of gas. And so when the North Vietnamese try again to invade South Vietnam in April 1975, their initial thrust is resisted by the South Vietnamese. But as the South Vietnamese run out of fuel, as they run out of ammunition, the South Vietnamese military starts to collapse in front of them. And what the North Vietnamese had expected to be more than a year-long operation turns into just a few weeks. And by April of 1975, South Vietnam falls. It collapses. The war is over. And next time we'll talk about what America was like in that post-Vietnam period. Of course, we'll talk about some things that happened right at the end of Vietnam, most notably Watergate. But we're going to concentrate on talking about sort of America and American society with the Vietnam complex. This idea that America can't do it all. That no matter how much we spend, we can still lose. So next class period, be prepared to talk about the 1970s. Again, this is a lecture for my dual enrollment students at South Doyle. You guys need to watch this and also read your book on it. And it is also for my Roane State guys at Oak Ridge. So if you guys will complete this by Friday, I hope to see you guys both, and hopefully you guys have gotten through most of these 2 lectures. I apologize that we've had to blow through this, but we're getting down to the wire, and I want to go through the important things and not really get bogged down on sort of superfluous matters. I'll see you guys later. Have a good day.